So in my last video, took a look at oscillators and the oscillators that I'm currently using in my DIY modular synth. Back here, those ones are the oscillators, right there and there. This time I'm going to be looking at a low-pass filter and how that sort of fits into the setup. Going to be looking at a couple of patches and how those patches affect our signal through the oscilloscope and just listening to stuff. Yeah, let's get to it. This is the first low-pass filter that I built. It's a Look Mum No Computer design, a patch, and on the Look Mum No Computer website is the stripboard layout. So it's easy to build if you have the right pieces for it. Don't have to like map the schematic to a stripboard layout or a PCB. This one has a high enough resonance that it actually will self-oscillate, which is the first thing I'll take a look at. Now you'll see on the oscilloscope, it's a rounded triangle wave. It sounds a lot like a sine wave because of that. It's a little bit more, even less intense and harsh than a triangle wave because of those rounded bits. It's not really readable on the screen, but this is oscillating at 32 kilohertz right now. This is the highest setting that you actually, well, actually, let me double check that. Yeah, almost the highest setting that you can have it oscillate at. 32 kilohertz is outside the range of human hearing, so this isn't going to be something that if I turn up the volume, you will actually be able to hear. But if I turn off the cutoff frequency, when the filter is self-oscillating, the cutoff frequency is going to determine what frequency that oscillates at. So if we take this down, let's get it down to about 1K, and then turn up the volume. That's still a little harsh. We'll drop that down. Sounds like a nice sine wave or triangle wave. You also notice that when this is self-oscillating or when you have high resonance, these two overflow LEDs will be lit up. When it's a high enough frequency, they'll look just lit, but if we go further down, can't even get it low enough to actually see it, but they will flash back and forth. Right? They won't actually be lit up at the exact same time. They will actually flash back and forth. So this is about at 190 hertz. And if we get down to those bass notes, that's down at about 65 hertz. So if let's take that resonance back down. First patch is just going to be cranking the cutoff all the way up. And I'm just going to patch in one of the oscillators that I went over in the last video. Let's start this off with a triangle wave. We'll see what happens to this as we run a triangle wave through the filter. So already you can see there's a change in the waveform, even with the cutoff all the way up. Instead of getting that absolute triangle wave, if I increase the frequency, it looks more like a triangle. But it's a little bit more relaxed. We're actually filtering out, even with the cutoff all the way up, a very little bit of what we have at the top end. So the just triangle wave on its own without going through the filter at all looks like this. Can see the sharp points on there. Other way. Very much a triangle wave. And by putting it through the filter, that wave gets modified. What that sounds like is going to be this. And you won't notice much of a difference between this barely filtered triangle wave and the raw triangle wave. So if we listen to the raw triangle wave, it sounds pretty similar. We're not making a lot of change to it, even though the wave shape actually looks different. But where we will get a change in that harmonic timbre, right, is when we change the cutoff frequency and start filtering out more of the top end. And you'll see as we do that, we get a rounder shape on the oscilloscope. We also lose some of the amplitude of the wave, right? The waveform has less peak to peak as we start to round off the top end, to the point where eventually it'll actually collapse and we won't hear anything. Now, the sonic differences on a triangle wave are not very much. There's not much of a sonic difference between the triangle being cut off and the triangle not being cut off. Something like a saw wave, this becomes much more apparent. So first, let's take a look again at what that saw wave just raw looks like and sounds like. Changing the voltage divisions, and here this is going to be a lot more harsh than the triangle. So in the waveform, you can hear that upper high pitch harshness to the sound. And that's what the main thing that we're going to be filtering out with a low pass filter, right? It's filtering out the stuff that's high up and giving us just the things that are lower. So first, let's see what that sounds like without changing the cutoff. It should be pretty much the same. A very similar noise. But if we start lowering that cutoff, and start to get rid of those higher frequencies, we hear it becomes a less harsh noise. We get rid of those harsh pieces, but still retain some of the harmonic pieces of it, some things that make it interesting. And similar to the triangle wave, as we get down lower, the waveform starts to change. We get more rounded peaks, and eventually the whole thing collapses and we get nothing. So this is the simplest patch one of the simplest patches you can make on a modular is just an oscillator into a filter and start messing around with the harmonic pieces of it. Let's see how this changes a square wave. It should look fairly similar. We'll go with a pretty fat pulse width. again, you can hear those harsh harmonic overtones, and as you bring down the cutoff, we start to get rid of those. And eventually the curve will round out and collapse. So this becomes very useful for making it sound more musical, essentially. You don't always want the super harsh tones, or sometimes you just want them for a moment. And when I get to envelopes and VCAs, we'll see how you can use that sonically in a way that doesn't just sound like buzzing, harsh noise. So the next thing we want to look at is the resonance of the filter and how that's affecting the overall waveform as well as tone of this. I think the easiest way to take a look at it first is with the triangle wave. Then it's not as, you can notice that because there's not as many harsh overtones. Alright, so here's the triangle wave again. Cutoff is all the way up. We're going to increase the resonance. You can see our waveform's already going crazy. We're adding extra, basically waveforms at certain frequencies. We're adding, if we zoom in on this, you can see that spot where it's getting fuzzy while we have just the triangle. Those places where it's fuzzy is actually, it's a little hard to see. Let me pause this for a moment. If we pause it, you can see inside of that part of the wave is another wave, and that's what the resonance is doing. It's adding waveforms at a certain frequency, and that frequency is the cutoff. Right? So where we saw the self-resonating before, and we saw that the waveform was producing a outside of human hearing waveform at the top of the cutoff, we're doing that same thing, but we also have the triangle wave in there as well. And you won't be able to hear that at this frequency, but if we take this down, you can hear that buzz of the resonance, right, as we do a filter sweep, and see the weird waveforms that we're getting as those two pieces interact. Once again, we have the certain, at the cutoff frequency, we're getting a waveform that's interacting with our input wave. And you can see again the sine-ish triangle wave that the resonance is producing. That's the filter itself. And as I sweep it down, you'll see that peak to peak gets wider, which means the frequency of the resonance is lower. Until we hit a certain cutoff where that flattens out. And if we go even further, we lose the triangle wave. So that's why when you're using a resonance-based filter, if you have enough resonance, you'll almost hear two pitches. Right? At some point, our ears will trick us into hearing the waveform within the waveform as another pitch. Right now you can hear the lower pitch of the triangle wave and the higher pitch of the resonance. As those two get closer together, they're harder to differentiate, right? So as our cutoff frequency starts to match our oscillator frequency, it becomes harder to distinguish the two. and as you move them farther away, you can hear two distinct pitches. So the next patch we want to look at is the CV, right? So the CV on this particular filter is going to control the cutoff frequency. So any voltage going into the CV input right here is going to basically be voltage controlling this knob. So instead of moving it, something else will be moving it. In this case, I'm going to use the other oscillator. We're going to grab a sawtooth. Take that down a little bit. Sorry, that was definitely louder than it should have been, but I'm good in editing, you know. So you can see the rounded wave on here, right? If we bring the cutoff up, that's less rounded. Getting a little bit of interference from something, and I'm not sure what, but I'll figure that out at some point. The joys of DIY modular. I'm going to take the triangle wave of my second oscillator, and we're going to plug that triangle wave at a low pitch, not quite LFO sort of levels, but getting close to LFO levels. We'll plug that into the CV, and as I increase the amount that we're controlling, you'll see those peaks move. So we have the triangle wave from another oscillator changing each one of these, which is why they're moving. So you can think of that as having a triangle waveform there controlling the CV. I don't have this set up right now to be able to actually see that waveform, but I might re-record this later and do that. So if we bring up the resonance, you'll see those are changing as well. The more the amount knob is up, the greater that change is going to be. This is almost at frequency modulation levels, rather than an LFO or an envelope changing these things. And that becomes more noticeable if I bring the pitch up of the second oscillator, the modifying oscillator, close to the input oscillator. So with that, with the resonance up, the control voltage amount up, and the input oscillator being close to the modulation oscillator, you can hear they start to sound as if we are running a two oscillator patch, but it's still just one oscillator through the input, the resonance, and the control of another oscillator. So those are some basic patches on this low-pass filter. In the next one, I'll go into probably an LFO or a envelope. We'll see. So that was filters. Well, a low-pass filter. One thing I forgot to mention in the video was that on the Look Mum No Computer site, he mentions you can change the resistor value specifically for the cutoff to like a 5K. And you can do that, but it does lower the usable range of that potentiometer. So just keep that in mind. You'll have to do some adjustments if you want it to have a full usable range. Yeah, that was low pass filter. Next time we'll probably take a look at the LFO and then on to envelopes and VCAs.